We've got a new sponsor of the show that we'd like to thank, Subculture Group, South Florida, and our friend Rodney, for the best in culture, arts, and entertainment. The Subculture Group, from its restaurants, night spots, and coffee. You don't want to miss it, and you won't if you're in South Florida, because these are the places that we find ourselves hanging out at, and you will too. So thanks a lot. Welcome back to another episode of Tales from the Vault. Thanks for tuning in. Excited this week to have Alex Keck joining us. Alex is a really strong chess player who I encountered on Clematis Street at Subculture on chess night, and now we both attend the Delray Beach chess night, which is fun as well. But the reason we have Alex in studio is because he's got a really interesting job, and I want him to tell you about that. Alex, can you kind of...
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I think you and I, when we first met, you were talking about starting this podcast, and now you're
right.
30 episodes in. And we actually met just outside where we're recording right now, over a game of chess, which is, one of the best ways to get to know somebody.
I agree.
But yeah, when it comes to what I do for a living, I wish it could be chess, but unfortunately I'm, not good enough. I work with classic cars, enthusiast cars. I help bring them to market. I help folks acquire or sell cars that they either have in their collection or hope to have in their collection. And I work with a company called Broad Arrow Auctions. I've been fortunate to be there for about 3-4 years now, I guess it is, and it's been my passion, and it's really been a joy to make a career out of it so far.
So when you say classic cars, what do you mean?
Classic. So typically when you're talking about classic cars, you're talking about anything more than 20 years old is typically what I would designate as a classic car. But it's funny. I mean, Porsche now, with what they're doing with their rehabilitation program of some cars, they consider, a Porsche Carrera GT a classic now. They're restoring those in their classic department, and those are only 15 years old, and so. Everyone has a different definition, but I tend to go, more than 20 years.
Okay, so kind of like a vintage car, is that fair to say? It's something more than 20 years old.
Right.
And within that giant category of cars in general, are there certain types that you focus on?
Yeah, so my background is with early Porsche. So I worked in the restoration world all through high school and college, and that's how I got into this field. So that was always my first love, was air-cooled Porsche. So I specialize in the restoration of what are called 356s. So that's the first generation of Porsche before they came out with the 911 in 1965. It's a tiny little air-cooled 4-cylinder motor that just have endless charm, and that's really where my first love is. And so that's what I tend to specialize in, is the 50s and 60s cars. But it's interesting to see how that market has kind of dipped over the last few years, and so people are focusing on stuff from the 80s and 90s and modern hypercars. And so my focus has kind of shifted a little bit more towards that. But my first love was always the early stuff.
Well, let's talk about that. How do you first get into cars in general?
Yeah, so I grew up in Nebraska, of all places. I grew up working on, some farms, and, I think I was 13 or 14, and I got my first W-9 job doing oil changes and tire repairs.
Nice.
At a small shop in Nebraska, and it's the archetypal small shop where you look at all the walls and they're covered in all those porno calendars, right? And then like Friday nights, the boss would all the mechanics and the boss would place bets and have me and this other guy that were working, all the young kids, they'd have us brawl it out and put money on us. I mean, it was hilarious. It was hilarious to work there. But I did that for a couple of years, and then when I was 16, I was really fortunate where I met it's kind of a funny story, actually. I was racing motorcycles at the time. I was restoring bikes, and I kind of got there was a gentleman in Nebraska who was racing in SCCA back in the 80s and 90s, and he'd heard of me. He heard that there was some kid that was racing bikes, and he thought, okay, maybe I could teach this kid how to drive cars. And so I met this guy. He called me up one day, said, come over to my place. Let's take this old 911 out. And growing up in Nebraska, you dream of these cars. You don't necessarily ever see them. And so he opens up his garage, and it's this beautiful, I think it was a 73 911 with an IROC tail on it. This thing was total hot rod. And we start ripping around downtown Lincoln, Nebraska. And we're doing, we're doing $120 down, Capitol Street, which is in downtown Lincoln. And we go by a protest. And of course, there's a lot of cops at this protest, and doing $120, you get out of a straight pipe 911, you get a little bit of attention. And so this old guy I'm with, who's probably a little bit brain damaged from a few too many crashes back in the 80s, right? It was a protest with regards to some sort of discrimination and race related ordeal, and he throws out a black power symbol out the driver's window, and as he's doing it, of course, the cops light us up. And I look over to him. I think I was 15 at the time. I'm like, "Whoa, we got to pull over." And he just looks at me and he goes, "You really think they can catch us?" Downshifts, rev matches, just like blows out of there. We're running on the street on slicks. And so he starts to go to put, some heat in the tires. So he starts swerving around the lanes to make sure the tires get enough heat, and just throws the car into a corner. But you can hear this car across town, right? I mean, it's a straight pipe 911. And fortunately, what I hadn't realized at the time is there are what are called no chase laws in Nebraska. So it's illegal for cops to engage in a car chase for more than 5 miles or something like that to protect safety. So at the time, I was thinking, we outran the cops, right? I thought it was super cool, but what it was actually the case is they couldn't legally chase us. But anyways, that was a roundabout way of saying he introduced me to a gentleman named Terry Warwick, who took me under his wing, and Terry, I worked essentially his apprentice for, all through high school and college, and I was really fortunate that he exposed me to incredible cars, clientele, a world that, was totally foreign to me growing up in Nebraska, and so I owe a lot to Terry, and I was really fortunate.
So you've got this guy who's kind of your mentor, and,
right.
And what was his, at this point, I mean, before that ride in the Porsche, was it already your dream car, or is that the moment where you knew Porsche was your car?
They were all such like abstract foreign ideas in my mind, right? Like I'd never seen a Ferrari F40. I'd never seen a Porsche 356 in person. I'd never seen an early 911. I'd spent my nights watching YouTube videos. This was the time when a YouTube channel called Petrolicious had just come out, and they created these incredible cinematic videos of these cars, and they would just entrance me, right, as a 13, 14-year-old that had never seen this stuff. And so I was trying to live out these dreams through the computer screen, but this was kind of the first time I'd ever, seen these cars in person. And I was restoring motorcycles at the time because that's all I could afford. I couldn't afford a car yet. So I was buying up these early Honda CBs for a few $100 and, flipping them. And then I was buying early BMW Airheads, early BMW motorcycles. And that's when I started racing those. And then eventually I met Terry. And when I went out to Terry's shop for the first time, I rode out in an early BMW I had, restored. I'm using very, it's hardly restored. I just replaced a few parts and got the motor running. But I was very proud of it. And I got out to Terry's shop, and Terry's shop is in the middle of the country in Nebraska, right? You come over this hill, and all of a sudden I remember being on this motorcycle and seeing in the middle of a cornfield a Porsche Speedster, an early 356, and a Porsche Slant Nose, a later Slant Nose model. And I just remember my heart was just like, that visceral feeling of like, this is so cool. And I'd never seen anything like this. And to see it in a cornfield in Nebraska, of all places, just kind of blew my mind. And so I remember I kind of parked my motorcycle and I walked into Terry's office, and I was talking really fast. I was really nervous. And I told Terry, listen, I'll work for you for free. I'll clean your toilets. I just want to be around these cars. I just want to learn something. It's like 15, 16 at the time, right? And Terry's just kind of sitting back there all laid back and cool, and just says, well, I think we can do better than free. Can you start today? And he actually, there was a tractor out back, and my interview was whether or not I could get that tractor started by the end of the day. And fortunately, it was just a clogged fuel filter, so it was a very, very simple fix. I think anything more complicated than that, I wouldn't, I wouldn't have passed. I think Terry probably would have still hired me anyways. But I fortunately got that tractor running, and I worked for Terry for all through school, and that was just, that's what I loved. And looking back on it, I don't know if this is the best decision, but most days in high school I wouldn't go to school. I'd go out to the shop, because it was through Terry that I got into, figuring out how these cars work, what it takes to build a project with of high quality, right? And being able to spend the time and understanding that 95% of your time is spent on that last 5% of details when restoring these cars. And it was just I owe everything to this guy. I mean, like, it's funny when you look back on life, you kind of realize that the different chapters are segmented by the mentors that you had during those periods, and how your life would change if you hadn't met this one guy at a certain time. And if I hadn't met Terry, my life would be very different right now.
He had you fixing cars, rebuilding, restoring.
Right.
Was that part and parcel of learning how to drive, or are the two very distinct things?
Yeah, I think it was distinct. It helped with getting the cars dialed in, right? So you could learn how to, tweak with the suspension a little bit, the camber a little bit, the alignment on the wheels, and making sure everything, the carbs were correctly synced and everything like that. I didn't get into driving until a little bit later. But keep in mind, when I say driving, I mean, this is, we're talking very slow cars, right? Like a 356 has, 100 horsepower on a good day, right? I mean, yes, they weigh 2,000 pounds, but, I'm not a good enough driver to do much more than a couple hundred horsepower. And I know where my limits are, but I was, more of the lessons from working at Terry were the quality of, the lesson of what quality work is, and B, also what it means to be a good mentor. I mean, Terry was the type of guy. I remember one day, this story always cracks me up. I was under a Porsche 912, so that's an early, 911 style body, but with a 4-cylinder similar to the body the engine out of a 356. And I was welding around the rear torsion bar where it had rusted out a little bit. And as I was welding in this new piece, I'm under the cars, it's on a lift, and, I think I was 17, 18. I just learned how to use a MIG welder, trying to figure this out. And it hadn't occurred to me that the interior of the car was all original, it was beautiful, but the interior, the way that they cushioned the upholstery was horsehair. And so welding under the car like that, I'm under there, all happy as can be, welding, laying, horrible welds, just learn how to do this, as the car is fully ablaze above me, right? I mean, the horsehair just lit up like a bomb, and I'm totally oblivious to what's going on as I'm under the car. And it was moments like that where, Terry never yelled, he never, it was never mad. I mean, he went through all of those same lessons, as he was learning, and that was really important.
So tell me about the transition. So you're with Terry, you're with him all through school, and you finished school. What's your thought process there? Was you're finishing school?
It was funny. So just to give a little bit more background, my dad was in the realm of academia and religion, and so there was a little bit of pressure to kind of follow that same route. No one in my family had an interest in cars, and so it was a little bit, not necessarily taboo, but there was definitely some pressure. And so I was always thinking, okay, by the time I graduate, how do I want to go about, making a career for myself, and whether or not that is the academia route, or whether or not I'm able to convert this car thing into something, viable. When I was at Terry's shop, Terry didn't have a consignment program, but I remember I approached Terry and was just like, hey, this Bring a Trailer thing, which is an online auction platform, was really blowing up. A lot of our clients here in Nebraska, they don't really know how to sell cars other than an ad in the newspaper. I think this is something we can do to help these people bring these cars to market, because something you don't realize about Nebraska is because of Offutt Air Force Base being there, a lot of these service members back in the 50s and 60s and 70s were bringing these cars back. And so a lot of these barn finds still exist there, right? I mean, we were finding 356s and early 911s that, were really special. And I was able to buy up some of these cars myself when I was in high school for very, little money, just because Nebraska was so behind, where everyone else was. And so I thought there was an opportunity for us to sell cars on behalf of our clients on a consignment basis on an online auction platform, Bring a Trailer. And so Terry and I remember the first, I think we did about over $1 million in, total sales in a short period of time. And that kind of took off, and I thought, okay, the auction world's kind of interesting. And then I was fortunate to, through some contacts and other mentors, I was able to get in touch with a gentleman who worked at Haggerty on the insurance side, and he introduced me to the folks who had just started a company called Broad Arrow Auctions. It was the folks at another auction company had decided to leave for various reasons and start their own company, and I was fortunate to, they needed some 22-year-old to do all the grunt work, and so I moved up to Detroit, where Broad Arrow was headquartered, and the first few months, I was kind of just opening the mail and, taking out the trash, and from there, I was kind of given just a specialist title, more so in title than anything else. That wasn't really what my role had looked like, and I was really fortunate to meet a collector in Detroit. Just total happenstance. We ran into each other at a grocery store, and we built up a friendship, and over time, sold 8 figures worth of cars out of his collection, and that really helped me build a reputation with within the industry, and also I was just really lucky.
Do you feel like that deal obviously made you look really good at your company? I mean, hey, we've got this guy and he's doing 8-figure business. That's nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, but at the same time, when you look back at that sort of stuff, what's daunting is, it's total luck that I ran into this guy at a grocery store, right? And that's what's kind of daunting about the industry, is when you look back at those moments and you think, how can I replicate this again at the next auction? How can I, bring X amount of cars to market, X amount of value? And you look back at what you've done in the past and you realize how much of that is based on luck. It's a little intimidating. Right.
Well, you make your own luck. I mean, you have the kind of personality.
Well, everyone goes to the grocery store, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like...
but you have the kind of personality, from my experience with you, that you're very easy to talk to, and you're approachable, and you're not dismissive of someone. Maybe they know nothing about cars, but you're still more than happy to talk to them about it.
Yeah, well, it's really kind of you. And what I love about cars, and what I love about hobbies in general, we met over chess, and we're instant friends because of a shared passion for chess. I mean, we were just talking about this earlier. If you have that foundation of already that shared passion, you kind of just, it's so easy to build a friendship.
That's right.
That, right? Mm-hmm. And I always when it comes to clients, I always think, okay, they're friends first. I'm never going to put them in a situation where I feel like we're going to do them a disservice. I'm never going to tell them, okay, we're bringing this car to market, say without a reserve. I'm not going to tell you, this car is an estimate of $500 to $600,000 if I really think that, the car is going to sell for $200,000, right? And so the most important thing you can do is, and this is something my dad has always talked to me a lot about, is, coming from the world, from the role as a pastor, is, make sure you can always sleep well at night. Make sure you always do people, right, and take the high road.
I think that's great. I think that whenever there's a large sums of money on the line in business, it's very easy for feelings to get hurt and for anger to kind of stir. But obviously, you must have managed that very well, dealing in these large sums with these cars.
Yeah, and it was kind of at the point, too, where I was selling some cars where it was numbers I couldn't really even fathom, right? Like growing up in a town, Nebraska like that, you don't necessarily see that kind of wealth, or, everyone is very humble in how they present themselves, and, no one is driving around in a modern Ferrari or anything like that.
Maybe Warren Buffett.
No, not even that. In Nebraska, you see him driving around, and he goes to McDonald's every morning. I think he drives an older Cadillac, an 8-year-old Cadillac, right? And he still lives in his humble house. That's kind of just the ethos in Nebraska. You don't see guys walking around with Rolexes on their wrists or anything like that. And I appreciated that, and that's something I hoped I could bring into the world of, of auctions. Yeah.
Oh, that's so. Talk a little bit more about the kinds of cars that you're dealing with. You went from Porsches, and then you've kind of mentioned Ferraris, and is it the gamut of these incredible cars? Most of them at least 20 years old, but is it the gamut, or have you really focused on kind of a few brands that you really enjoy? So
what I specialize in is one thing. Cars that I've helped the transactions with is another thing. So I've been involved in sales from everything from modern Ford GTs, Koenigsegg's, modern hypercars, to all the way back to pre-war cars, right? Like you take pre-war Bugattis, Delahaye's, Hispano Suizas, Talbot Lagos, brand names you that don't exist anymore. And it's been interesting because I never really had much of a love for these pre-war cars, but I remember the first time I did 100 miles an hour on a highway in a pre-war Duesenberg. And I was like, this is special. This is really cool. And so now my love has really shifted a lot towards the pre-war stuff, which is, an area of the market that obviously has lost a lot of its love over the past few years. And, not many guys out of my generation are super into that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, a lot of the mechanics and the apprentices of those mechanics that specialize in pre-war cars, is a dying industry, right? A lot of the apprentices do the same thing I did, right? Where you're working in the shop, you're getting your hands dirty every day, but then you go take a white collar job, where you're transacting these cars, because that tends to be where the money is. But there's certainly an opportunity for guys my age to go into the restoration field of these early pre-war cars, and there's certainly money to be made.
It seems really interesting how across multiple collectible categories, people like to learn their history and go back to something that maybe they weren't familiar with growing up because it preceded that. But there's so much to learn, and like you encountered it. I think the same thing happens with sports cards and baseball players.
Yeah.
Baseball players that weren't alive, you've never seen them play, but you go back and look, learn the history, and get excited about a pre-war baseball card.
What's that car for you? I mean, did you have a car on your wall when you were in your bedroom when you were growing up?
Yeah, I think I was a big movie guy growing up. So like the DeLorean from Back to the Future, or, maybe television, like the 60s Batmobile, the Dukes of Hazzard car, maybe even the Mystery Machine from Scooby-Doo. Anything that was kind of in a movie or television show. And I think that, Michael Knight Rider, I think that that's kind of carried with me because I love production art. Not so much fine art that is painted just for the sake of the painting, but something that was used in the process of marketing something else, like a toy or a comic book. Or you mentioned the girly calendars, from the 40s or earlier, these beautiful pinup girls drawn by artists like George Petty or Vargas. And, they're beautiful. And I love that they aren't just beautiful drawings. They were used to sell calendars, so I think it's the same way with cars for me. I mean, if I could have any car, I have a client who has a Batmobile from the 60s.
Oh, no kidding.
It's so cool.
A reproduction or one from the...
It's actually a one from the 60s, And, driving around in that car is like the biggest drug. I mean, you the attention, and it's so much cooler than we may be right next to, it's in Silicon Valley, so we may be right next to one of these supercars or a Ferrari, but no one is paying attention to that.
Yeah.
They're paying attention to, it's got a megaphone and it's got a flamethrower on the back, and like, it just looks insane, and
no amount of money can buy that kind of cool, right?
It makes kids smile when you drive by in a way that no other car does. Sure. And so I always thought that was super cool. But okay, so now you're out of school. You've linked up with this auction company. God, that seems like such a unique job. I mean, I don't meet a lot of people who have that. I think a lot of people would think that's a dream job. I mean, do you kind of have any perspective on, you're so young and you're in this amazing spot. Is it easy to kind of appreciate the moment? And
yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think that's really important to always keep things in perspective. I compare it to what I was doing a few years ago. Every day at the end of the day, after working on all these cars, my back would be sore, and you'd be just dirty, filthy, going and showering at the end of the night. And now I'm really doing what I love, where I'm working with incredible people. I'm really proud of the colleagues I have. I can say with confidence that I know, if in any given deal, I know they're always going to handle things with integrity, which I think is really important to be able to say about the people you work with. But I've also, I've been really fortunate to be able to surround myself with the right people, whether it be Terry or, Ken On, the gentleman who founded Broad Arrow. Those mentors you have, especially when you're, in your early 20s, that's what's going to make you the man you're going to be, in your 30s and 40s and 50s and so on. And I hope to be able to do that for someone else one day, right? I'm still at that point where, I'm always looking for mentors and people I can, learn from, because God knows I have a lot to learn. But I hope to be able to do the same thing for someone else one day.
What is your father still living? Mm-hmm. How does he feel about you didn't go the academic route?
Yeah.
You're in this kind of this very market driven, high powered luxury field. How does he feel about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I brought him to an auction actually. I think it was 2 years ago or last year for the first time. It was our Amelia Island auction, which is in March, and that's one of our flagship sales where we're selling 150 cars, and the total value is something around like 50 million or thereabout. And I got to take him out in some of these cars, and I think it gave him a whole new appreciation for what I do, because when we were talking about, when I call him, every day at the end of the day to talk about different things that were happening, or to get his opinion on how to handle different, client or colleague, relationships. We were always talking in abstractions, right? I would tell him, okay, I'm traveling to this city to go drive this car, or I'm going to this city to go, to drive this track, or whatever it might be. He wasn't able to really kind of understand what that was. It's just not his world. But I think having him there gave him a whole new appreciation for that. He'd never seen anything, like that, like the auctions. I mean, auctions are very, by their nature, very theatrical, right? And they're a spectacle. And I think he really appreciated that. Also, just from the perspective as a pastor, I mean, what he does any given week is he's, working with his music department, in the full choir and an orchestra, and different speakers, and he's managing different classes. And so he's, although there's a lot of differences between what we do, I think he really appreciated the whole spectacle of it and everything that goes into that. I mean, these auctions are 3, 4, 5 months in the, between each one, stateside. So the amount of work that goes into it is just, it can't be understated.
Are there 2 main auctions that you guys do every year?
We have 2 flagship sales on when it comes to in the United States. We just started our European operations, but the 2 stateside are our Monterey sale in August, and our Amelia auction sale in March. And so those are our 2 flagship sales, one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds really. I bet those are really busy times of the year for you.
Yeah, well, right now we finish up our catalog for Amelia. This weekend is when the catalog deadline is, and so everyone's rushing to try to get cars into the auction and try to figure out what if it's a good time to bring this car to the market or a good time to bring that car to the market, and it's things are tight right now.
Is there a special department or group that deals with celebrity-owned cars? Is that a thing? Who owns something?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. No, not necessarily. And it's interesting to see how celebrity ownership affects value, right? You look at take a motorcycle like a Husqvarna owned by Steve McQueen or something like that, and how that, just skyrockets the value. And it's the same way for, if Steve McQueen's family were to ever sell that Speedster that the family owns. I mean, I have no idea what that car would bring today. But no, we don't necessarily have a department that specializes in that. But it is always fun to see when we do take a car with some sort of, ownership history attached to it. It's interesting to see how that affects the value, because sometimes it does, but other times, it doesn't. A lot of the times folks don't want cars with stories, right? They want a car with very low miles. They want, an example that's been very well preserved, been kind of tucked away in a garage, put on a battery tender and just kind of, maintained. But they don't want a car with a story. And so unless it's a name like Steve McQueen, it's not as though it will inherently add value.
Is that because Steve McQueen is associated with cars?
Yeah, and I'm just throwing out that name because he's from previous generations. I mean, he's the king of cool. What else can you say?
Right.
He's losing that, that same appeal. It's not the same as what it was 10 years ago, but.
Yeah, I guess the hope is that similar to the pre-war cars or the pre-war cards, people go back and are always curious about people like Steve McQueen, even after everyone is, no one has ever seen him, while they were alive, or while he was alive.
It's interesting to see how the market works. And the data, when you look at it, it makes sense. So Broad Arrow was acquired by a company called Haggerty, which is kind of the premier, one of the largest, if not the largest, classic car insurance company in the United States. And Haggerty has a huge amount of transaction data. They're able to see how much, all the cars under their umbrella were sold and bought for. And so being able to look at that data is really interesting because you can follow these market trends and identify them pretty precisely. And when you start to break it down, it really makes sense where the peak of the market at any given time is 40 years prior from present. So right now, the peak of the market is 86. And that makes sense because it's the guys, who had those cars from 1986 on their walls when they were teenagers that now have the money, the spending power to be able to, acquire these cars. And so the market kind of bell curves around that 40-year prior from any given point.
That makes sense. And now that you're saying that, I think another car that really stood out to me was, you have a show called Magnum PI?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, the red Ferrari and that was, a classic.
Right.
And maybe even the van and the A-Team. Do you remember the A-Team?
Before my time.
It's before your time.
I've seen the remake.
They made a remake.
Yeah, right.
I'm pretty sure they had the van in it, but those cars for some reason. A similar question, I guess, along those lines would be, what about cars that were used in races or like famous races? Is that a separate, or is it all just part of the story of the car? And some people may want a story car and some people may not.
It really depends. And, it gets really tricky with a lot of early race cars because early race cars, as you would expect, were crashed, right? And a lot of what people care about when it comes to race cars in cars in general, is originality. But when you have a race car that went to Le Mans, just got beat up, right? Two guys would be going down the Mulsanne Straight, 200 miles an hour. They'd be, bumping into each other, right? So the chassis and the bodies would be replaced. And so it gets a little bit tricky with these race cars because it becomes a problem of Theseus's ship, which I don't know if you're familiar with I think it's a Greek parable. The idea that Theseus goes out to war in his, warship, and over the course of 5 years before he returns, throughout the war and all of the battles, every single plank of wood of the ship is replaced during that 5 years.
Right.
And so the question when he comes back to port is whether or not that's the same ship that left 5 years ago.
That's interesting.
Right? And so that same parable, really rings true when it comes to cars because you look at these, a lot of times early race cars, they've been restored to an inch of their life. And you really start realizing how much of this car is the same car that ran Le Mans in 1962. Right.
Right.
And so that question of Theseus's ship is one that's always been really interesting to me when it comes to cars because, and it's interesting to see how much the market cares because sometimes it doesn't at all, right? You look at a car where it's like, you can't really point to much on this car that's original to what would have, ran in the 50s or 60s or pre-war. And it doesn't really affect the value as much as you would expect, which has always been really interesting to me.
What about the engine, though? Wouldn't the engine be something that is intact, or
no? Because a lot of the times, if the engine was blown up in period, they take the motor, and you have very skilled guys. Whether or not this is right or wrong, I'll leave this to someone else to decide. But they'll restamp the motor with the original numbers from the original block, right? So if the original block read 1, 2, 3, they'll take. They'll be able to file down where the numbers are on the new block, and they'll stamp that in. And people have gotten so good at that it's very difficult to tell. So in the last few years, there's been some technology where you can X-ray the motors and get a sense of whether or not those stampings are original. But there's, like you mentioned, whenever there's a lot of money involved, there's a lot of, potential for bad actors.
Right.
Yeah.
So to someone who is new to cars, are there general rules about value in terms of restoration versus original?
Yeah, that's a good question. At the very high end, so take for example, you have a 1973 911. At the very high end of the market, you'll see two types of cars. One that is highly original, low miles, been well preserved, what we consider a preservation car. And that's what I really find interesting is to, see these cars that have been well preserved and see how they left the factory in Stuttgart. 50 years ago. And then you have cars that, are very highly restored, where you have guys out on the West Coast, some shops like, Will Hoyt, or you take like a, Emery 356, and these cars have been restored within an inch of their life, and they're a work of art. But how much of that is, similar to when the car left Porsche? I mean, it's a totally different thing at that point. But you can appreciate it because the craftsmen, the guys at these restoration shops were able to do that. And so that was always really interesting when I was in the restoration world. When we got our hands on a car that was, very original, I remember a 356 we had. It was a Prie Speedster. So I think it was in 1954. And the car had, I want to say it was 700,000 original miles. The car had never been restored. The engine had been rebuilt only once in those 700,000 miles. And this car had been driven around Nebraska. But you look at that car and you look at the details, and we'd always love to dissect it because we'd love to see how the Porsche engineers from the factory would put this screw. Would they use a flat head here, a Phillips head here? Would they, what's the exact distance between this point and this point on the car, or this piece of trim work and that? So it would always be really interesting, because a lot of the times we would just be guessing, right, when restoring these cars, because the car had already been restored once before. The body had an extra 60 pounds worth of Bondo on it, which is body filler. And so you're kind of just guessing. And so when we would get an original car, that would always be really exciting for me, because you could dissect all this minutia. And that's what I always found interesting about the restoration world. Like I said, the last 5% takes 95% of the time. It's those small details and getting things right. That's what I always found so fun within the realm of restoration.
What kinds of things are you learning at this point? I mean, you've done a ton of deals, you've met a lot of people. Is it the new relationships that you learn about new people, or are you actually learning more about the cars still?
Yeah, I have a long ways to go, before I'm an expert at this. I mean, I'm 3-4 years in. I'm still one of the most novice on our team, right? You look at the guys who I work with, they've been in this industry for 30, 40, 50 years sometimes. Wow. The amount of knowledge that they've accumulated. I mean, every room that I walk in, I'm the dumbest guy in there.
That's kind of a good way to be, though.
Yeah, right. It's when you're in your 20s, that's the right thing to do. Those are the right situations to put yourself in. And so I'm learning so much every day, and there's endless knowledge within the car world. Obviously, you can learn, like I mentioned, you can learn on, if you're looking at some early Ferrari, whether or not they used Phillips or flathead screws here, how to tell if, this bolt is original compared to, like, the markings on an original bolt out of Germany compared to a Chinese knockoff and stuff like that. And I still find that interesting, but what keeps drawing me back every day is the people you meet in the industry. I've been really fortunate to I've worked with really fascinating clients and learn about their lives and their families. And that's what keeps me coming back. I don't think I could work in a job where I was, behind a desk all day, not, talking to people, even if it involved cars. It's the people that keep bringing me back. So that's what motivates me right now. Still a ton to learn, and I'm really fortunate to be around the right people.
Do you find that cars are a very personal thing for their owners? So, like, if someone trusts you with their car, then they probably would trust you with, brokering anything for them. I mean, it's kind of their baby. Is that how it is? Yeah,
that's a good way to put it. People attach so much of their... But to that point, though, they're not just attached in a personal way, but a lot of these cars are assets to people,
right? Which
is important. And that's something that's happened over the last few years, where cars have become very speculative, which I don't know if that's good or bad for the industry. It's not my place to say. But people are looking at it as an asset class. And so when someone's trusting you with a car, it's like the equivalent of them trusting you with their 401k or something like that,
right?
Which that does add a whole new level of responsibility. For instance, if I'm selling a, pair of Ford GTs at an auction without reserve, the estimate on the cars together is somewhere around $2 million for the pair. Those cars end up selling and hammering at $700,000. If this was their retirement fund,
right?
There's some responsibility there, right?
But that seems to be the case whether it's a car or a comic book or
right.
any asset.
Right.
The auction game is a risk, and
sure.
Things go underestimate all the time, or they go way overestimate. I guess with some collectibles, I feel like and I'm trying to figure out if there's a nostalgia inherent in cars like there are in other collectibles. A comic book may be irreplaceable, not just because you can't find another one out there, but because this is the one my father gave me when I was in the hospital and that I read while I was, in bed for 2 weeks. It's the only thing I read over and over again. And so it's irreplaceable from that aspect, whereas the car may have, this huge value, but is it really personal, or do people look at it more like a financial asset?
They become a part of the family. It's just to give you a little bit of an anecdote. I was involved in the transaction of a Mercedes 300 SL last year that had been in the family. The father had owned it, I think, for 40, 50 years.
Wow.
And the car had become a part of the family. And after the father had passed, selling this car to the rest of the family had to sell for financial reasons. I mean, keeping a car, a 7-figure car in a house that was worth, a third of that didn't really make sense. And the security of it was also difficult. It was hard to make sure this car was always going to be well preserved and not damaged. And so they thought the best way to move forward was to sell it. But this car had become a part of the family. And that's what was so fun about that deal. And being involved in that was getting to know this family, hearing the stories of this car, going through the photo albums with this family, being in the auction room when this car was selling, and hugging the family in a circle as the car is selling, as everyone is weeping because it feels like they're letting it go, almost a part of their family, right? Their father's legacy. I mean, the father had put 50 years, 40 years of work into this car to make it perfect. And then for them to see it cross the block was one of them. It was, I was weeping. I mean, it was it's definitely a tearjerker. But to your point, that car had become a part of their family. It became the last totem of their father. Right?
Well, I have one more question for you. Give us a little snapshot of what the market looks like and what your sense for the future is.
I wish I had a crystal ball. I wish I could say that I knew that, 2 weeks ago when the Bachmann Ferrari collection went to Mecum, I wish I could say I knew that, a 288 GTO was going to bring, high 8 figures or high 7 figures, excuse me, and Enzos were going to be 7-8 million. I mean, I wish I, could have foreseen that last year. Those are not cars I would have expected to skyrocket at that rate. But to that same point, there are some predictable elements of the market. Like I said, from any given time, 40 years prior tends to be where the peak of the market is, and that makes sense. I hope to see a resurgence in pre-war cars and, some early post-war GT, Ferraris and Porsches. I don't know if we're going to see that in the next 5 to 10 years. I wish we were, because that's where my love is. And, the folks that did buy at the peak of the market, in 2020, 2021, they're seeing kind of a real hit on their portfolio when it comes to cars. But I'd love to see a resurgence and stuff like that. But it is interesting to see where there's a real market for hypercars right now. The modern Ferrari LaFerraris, Porsche 918s, McLaren P1s, the modern Ferrari SP3s. These cars that don't necessarily do a ton for me. I can appreciate what feats of engineering they are, and they're wicked fast. I mean, you get in these cars and you punch it down a straight line, and it feels like you're just being teleported from point A to point B. But I tend to have a real love and affinity for the cars where, you're going 40 miles an hour, but it feels like you're going 150. Not the cars like, a Ferrari LaFerrari where you're doing 200 miles an hour and it feels like you're doing 80 miles an hour, another car. So we'll see.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, this has been great, and I'd love to have you on again to talk more cars, and maybe we could play some chess on camera too. That would be really fun.
I'd love to.
Thanks very much for coming, and thank everyone for listening to another episode.